After a few weeks of living in my first off-campus home, I began to suspect something was wrong. I was aware that I got what I paid for since it was so cheap. It was a small, attached house with dated appliances and creaky floors, but it was close to campus. As a broke college student, I thought it was a steal, especially with it being an attached house. Once the semester started, I began noticing weird things around my home. I'd wake up to find items were missing or moved. It took me a while to notice since I spent most of my time in my bedroom. But books, bags, keys, and other things would be in different places than where I left them the day before. Loose change I left on tables or counters typically went missing without a trace. Food would also disappear. If I had leftovers in the fridge or snacks in the cupboards, I'd have less the next day. I began to worry I had a break-in problem, so I asked the landlord about putting in some new locks. During the installation, I asked the maintenance guy if he had any advice. He told me I should get cameras to be sure. Most security cameras I found online were out of my budget, so I ended up splurging a little bit for one that could see in the dark. After setting up the camera in the kitchen, I also took the time to hide my valuables in my room. That night, I contemplated staying up to see what was going on. I decided against it because I had a class in the early afternoon. Despite that decision, I awoke to a loud noise around 2 a.m. I couldn't tell exactly where it came from, but it had to be the living room or kitchen. I grabbed the wooden bat I kept on the side of my bed and proceeded out into the rest of the house. I quickly went for the light switch and peered around, looking for any signs of an invader. I looked in the living room briefly and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then there was the kitchen. A few chairs were a little out of place. Then I saw it. My camera was knocked over in the corner where I had placed it. I looked around quickly before picking it up and bringing it back to the room. I shut the lights back off and locked the door behind me. My laptop began whirring as I booted it up and plugged in the camera. Luckily, it wasn't too damaged. The program opened up and found the footage it recorded that night. I opened the video and searched through the timeline. I stopped when I saw movement. My throat dried up when I saw the vent in the corner of the room open up. A man crawled out and stretched as he stood up. The footage was fuzzy, but I could tell his clothes were old, and he was likely dirty from crawling around in the vents. Then I remembered the landlord mentioning that there was an attic, but it was sealed up. It may have been possible for him to enter the vents to go between the kitchen and attic. I watched him search my kitchen and take food from the cabinets. I scrolled ahead until he was directly in front of the camera. His eyes widened in a look of shock, as if he realized what he was looking at. Suddenly, the camera fell over, and he scrambled back to the vent. Then there was banging on the door. He was trying to come into my room. I called the cops and gave them all the information on the situation. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. The front door was wide open. They checked the vents anyway to ensure he wasn't hiding. Even though I was relieved that he was gone, the man was still out there. My kid's imaginary friend was starting to worry me. Emily was still young enough that having an imaginary friend wasn't an issue. With her mother and I splitting up, I also figured it was reasonable enough that she might find ways to cope. Going between her old home and the one I moved into after was an adjustment. Still, something felt off though. Normally, kids would be creative with their imaginary friends' looks, names, and personalities. At first, she told me she had a new friend named Randall. She said he was a wizard because he had a long gray beard. She also said that he lived in the basement. That seemed silly enough, but over the next few days, she would comment more about his gross appearance and smell. She also mentioned leaving food by the basement stairs for him sometimes. I didn't want rats or other pests, so I'd go check. But I never found anything like she said. I even went down to check the basement for plates, crumbs, or anything suggesting she left food out. The unfinished basement was empty, except for the boiler, some pipes and boxes I hadn't unpacked. The other thing I noticed was a distinct smell. I couldn't place it, but it was definitely bad. After another day or two, Emily told me something about her imaginary friend that sent shivers down my spine. It was a passing comment at first about how he used to live there. I questioned her, pointing out that she said he lived in the basement. He lives there now, but he used to live up here, like us. That started setting off alarm bells in my head. Where in the basement does he live? I don't know. I think he said there's a special cave. That made me really uneasy. I told her I didn't want her talking to Randall anymore. She said okay and went on playing with her toys. I inspected the basement again, but still found nothing. In an effort to avoid any other issues with Randall, I put a lock on the basement door to keep her from opening it. Things were normal for a few days, until Emily came to me looking frightened. I felt dread, anger, and tension as she explained what had happened. According to her, she no longer saw Randall, but he still talked to her. She said she could hear him by the basement door. He would ask for more food, which Emily couldn't deliver, so she tried her best to ignore him. Then she started crying. According to her, Randall began saying mean things to her, even going so far as to say he would hurt us. This made my blood boil, but it only got worse. Eventually, she said he apologized for being mean, and that he would forgive her if she came down to the basement with him. Emily told me she didn't want to play with him anymore. I told her she did the right thing by telling me, and that I was proud of her. I had Emily pack up and called her mom to arrange for her to stay there. On the ride there, I promised her I would take care of everything. Once I dropped her off and she was safe, I called the cops. I tried to explain the situation as best as I could to them. I suspected someone was living in my basement, and I wanted them out, but I had trouble finding them. I was waiting outside my home when 2 officers arrived. We went over the details and I brought them inside. After unlatching the basement door, we all descended, determined to find the unwanted guest. The officers immediately commented on the stench that had built up in our basement. They then identified themselves and asked anyone living down there to come out. When that didn't work, we began searching. After about 10 minutes, I noticed the paneling on one of the walls was a bit more pronounced than it was everywhere else. I called the officers over and we picked at it until the wall opened up, revealing a small room. The smell forced us to recoil as it was strong and bitter. Inside, there was a tattered mattress and a thin, older man with a gray, wiry beard. The officers got him to surrender without too much of a struggle. I later found out that the man was named Randall, and he used to live in our home. When he couldn't afford it anymore, he built that room so that he wouldn't be forced out onto the streets. Even though I felt a bit of sympathy for him, he preyed on my child. The wooden floors creaked eerily as I stepped further into the abandoned house. I knew the home had been abandoned years ago after an incident with the family that lived there. The story always changed. Someone said it was a murder. Another said that there was cult activity and satanic rituals. Someone else said they disappeared without a trace. I wasn't too interested in finding out what happened. I just wanted to explore and capture some footage for my exploration channel. I had been inspired to explore places like these by other content creators. I pushed those thoughts out of my mind and shifted focus back to my environment. The interior was dark. Most of the furniture was filthy. I could see rats scurrying about wherever I shone my flashlight. I made sure to get it all on camera to show how run down the place was. The once white walls were now a dingy brown with plenty of graffiti. Each room bore a horrific odor. I made a comment about it each time for the video I was recording. I was surprised to find dozens of empty beer bottles in the kitchen. It looked like some people came here to party, or they came here to forget about their problems. I didn't want to run into whoever would come here to drink, so I kept moving. As I made my way up the stairs, their creaking under my feet made me uneasy. I pushed through, determined to see what else I could find. In one of the bedrooms, I noticed junk everywhere. A brown-stained bed also had different boxes of food with crumbs and chunks strewn about. Approaching the next door filled me with a sense of dread. Before I could open the door, I heard a noise somewhere else in the house. Then there were loud steps, accompanied by the creaking wood underneath. My heart began to race. I would likely have to pass whoever was downstairs to get out. But that didn't matter because the steps began coming up the stairs. I opened the next door as quietly as I could. I slipped inside with minimal creaking and silently pushed the door shut. My breathing slowed down as I heard the person enter another room. Then I heard a voice, a man's voice. No, two men. There was someone else here? Trying to think of a way out, I looked around the room. In the corner sat a pile of black garbage bags. I didn't want to think about what could have been in there. I tried to focus on the voices, but then another noise made me turn back to the room. It was a crinkling sound. The light focused back on the bags and my stomach dropped. One of the bags was moving. At this point, I decided the best move was to quickly make a run for it. I quietly opened the door and peered out. There was a man standing in the doorway to the other room. He was facing the opposite direction. Every muscle in my body tensed as I began sprinting to get to the stairs. When the man turned around, he looked shocked. He was tall but very lean. With a mighty heave, I shoved him out of my way and into the other room. I descended the stairs as quickly as I could without falling. The creaking and thudding behind me told me that someone was at the top of the stairs. The front door opened loudly, then banged even louder as I slammed it behind me. An angry voice yelled, "You get out of here and don't ever come back!" I hopped the fence and sprinted towards my car. The engine was on before I even thought about where I was going. I took off. Calling the cops didn't cross my mind until much later. But I learned my lesson. An abandoned building isn't necessarily an empty one.